So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another custom scenario actually that was made by, I think, the person who sent me this map, which was Enxfits. It definitely seems like sort of someone's first scenario because I don't think it's actually finished yet. At least in terms of, if you have a look over here, you can see that it's a little bit sparse, and I would imagine that this is the sort of area where it would be intended that buildings and sort of tents and encampments would be placed. But even so, the mechanics of the fight should be finished with this sort of fortress area over here, and then this sort of outer settlement over here, and it's just going to be a 2v4 between, as I said, Enxfits, who is playing as Khan, and Eclipse 2500 of the Dark Cloud, who is playing as Harad, and then there will be 4 Orc armies around the edge of the map, which we'll go through first of all, I think, before we go into sort of the mechanics of the defending areas of the scenario. Over here at the back we have Arcturus, who is playing as Mordor, and he's got some Orc fodder here at the front, as you would expect in a situation like this. As it is a 2v4, I would expect the attacking armies to not have access to a huge amount of elites, and it does look as though that is the case. It looks as though Arcturus has got quite a lot of Orc fodder that make up the vast majority of his first lines, and then just in behind them he does have some Moran on guard as well. So the Moran on guard are better than the Orc fodder, of course, but they still aren't exactly the last word in terms of quality. Incidentally, I have actually been trying recently to disable the mud and sort of sand and snow textures on the units because I really don't like them. I feel as though they, you have all of these nice new units in particular, the sort of things that Cowering Coma, Crimson Beheli, and Sin of the Dark Cloud have been making, and then they get plastered in this really ugly sort of low quality mud smearing that goes all over them, and I really don't like it. And I tried to remove it from the texture folder, but it turned all of the units into black shadow people, which of course is even worse. So hopefully someone can assist me with that and find a way to disable it, because I really think it's detrimental to the overall look of the mod. It's a nice idea, but until the textures are actually improved, it's something that I certainly wouldn't want to use. So more Moran on guard, obviously, and then just in behind them, Orc Maulers. Again, the AP will be fairly useful against some Khandish and Harad units, but overall it might not be as useful as it would be against someone like Gondor. And then just in behind them we have some of the more genuine threats here, the Moran on infantry, which of course can go toe-to-toe with some of the sort of standard line infantry from other kingdoms of men. Got some Orc Maulers, and then finally it looks as though actually... is this the General's Bodyguard unit? It is. So Arcturus' General is in a unit of Moran on heavy Maulers, so it goes to show that this army is not exactly the most elite, but there is a lot of them. All of these units are fairly low tier, which means a lot of them have got over 200 men in the unit, so he's not going to be wanting in terms of manpower. Back here we've got DF Lister, who is playing as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. This could be one of his scenarios actually, because I do know that he made the last one that I showed, so this might be something that he has made. I'm sure that someone in the comments will let me know. Again, it's hard to keep track of all these things when I get a lot of stuff sent to me. But we got some Goblin Archers here at the front, of course, of some low tier ranged presence, which is obviously going to be quite useful in this sort of situation, considering the vastly superior numbers of the attackers. Even low tier archers can pay for themselves quite easily. Heavy Goblin Halberdiers, again, the armor-piercing phalanx could prove to be quite vital in this sort of situation if it turns into a grindy fight. More Heavy Goblin Halberds, more Goblin Archers, and then in behind them, of course, it wouldn't be a Misty Mountains army without a lot of Heavy Goblin Infantry. So there's a lot of these guys. Obviously, they can make pretty good tar pits. Just in general, they're a good unit to send in as your first wave, because they're not utterly dreadful like some units like Orc Fodder, but they're still not going to win you many battles, but they can still be fairly cost effective depending on the level of threat that they're facing. There's a huge amount of Heavy Goblin Infantry actually. That's like 9 units I think of Heavy Goblin Infantry, so that is that's like basically 1,500 units of Heavy Goblin Infantry, and then there's obviously the Heavy Goblin Halberds on top of that. But unlike Arcturus, he does actually have an elite unit. His General's Bodyguard is the Goblin King's Bodyguard, which is of course a multiple HP unit, so that should be pretty decent for him. There's also... those are just the Halberds, never mind. Anyway, here in the middle we have Orcs of the Misty Mountains played by Froggy. Froggy is someone else who's made scenarios in the past, so this again could be one of his, I'm not sure. So we got some Goblin Infantry obviously hiding away here at the front. Not going to win any contests in terms of quality, definitely a very poor quality unit, but there are a lot of them, and they are free outside of scenarios, of course. That's more Goblin Infantry, more Goblin Infantry. I'm actually glad that a lot of these armies are quite low quality, because they do vastly outnumber the defenders in this situation, so I'd be interested to see how this works out. 2 units of Heavy Goblin Halberdiers, another unit of Heavy Goblin Halberdiers, a lot of Orc Archers, Heavy Goblin Infantry again, so a huge amount of just sort of standard units. Some Snaga Skirmishers as well though, so they do have some Javelins in this army. Heavy Goblin Infantry. It's also entirely possible, of course, that there are some hidden units that I can't see. And his general is going to be a unit of Black Uruks of the mountains. So good, not quite as survivable as the Goblin King's bodyguard, but they should be pretty decent in a fight. And then finally, the final army, we have Tundra's Fox, who is playing as Mordor. Again, we've got a lot of Orc fodder, tons of fodder. We've got more Orc Maulers as well, so a bit more attack. We've got some Moran on guard as well, so it's looking like a pretty similar army indeed. We've got more Moran on infantry, some more Orc Maulers. But again, he does actually have an elite unit as his general's bodyguard, which is the Minas Morgul bodyguard, very similar to the Goblin King's bodyguard. Now then, let's go back to the defending position, and you can see here this sort of outer settlement. There isn't actually much in terms of choke points that they can use here. They can sort of take cover in the encampments in here, and they can use the streets as some manner of shelter. And considering the attacks actually don't have a huge amount of skirmishers to their name, they could actually do that without being punished for it too heftily. But even so, you'd still expect this outer defence to crumble eventually. But then they do obviously have that large stone fortress over there that the attackers also have to take. So obviously Engsfitz is playing as Khand, and this means there's a large cavalry presence today. Is this the general's bodyguard? Doesn't look like it, actually, interestingly enough. So we've got the Chieftain's Vanguard here at the front. Multiple HP horse archers, tough, strong, pretty good in melee as well. And they're also going to be backed up by some nomadic scouts. They are axe throwers on horseback, so very similar to Javcav. They can turn the tide in a cavalry fight quite well. Obviously Khan don't need too much help when it comes to cavalry versus cavalry combat, but they can still provide that. And honestly, with the lack of archers for the attackers here, the nomadic scouts could be very good at harassing the infantry as it advances. There are 2 units of them, as could the nomadic light cavalry. This is a lot of horse archers that can't have to their name, and they should be able to do a fair amount of damage without too much resistance. We'll see. Then we've got some Nurad Retainers. Interestingly enough, the Nurad Retainers don't really have much in terms of mounted units to actually get their teeth into, and they are melee cavalry, so honestly their primary function is a little bit null and void in this battle here. But they should still be able to be fairly useful at sort of harassing the enemy as they come forward with their charges. And then finally, a couple of units of Variag Windriders. Very similar story here actually. They are melee cavalry as their intended purpose, so, you know, not much in terms of, they don't actually have anything in terms of shock cavalry here, but they still have the potential to be incredibly annoying to the attackers as they move forward and do a lot of damage there. Nomadic Raiders obviously, and Variag Bowmen, so all of these archers, in particular the Variag Bowmen here, as we get a nice close look at them, should be able to control the skirmish fight with impunity. The attackers are going to have to be quite aggressive because they can't afford to sit back, because Khan's archers and their horse archers and their foot archers are going to give a substantial ranged advantage over here. The Variag Warriors as well, they should be able to beat most of the infantry that comes their way 1-to-1, but obviously it's not going to be 1-to-1, they're going to be outnumbered here pretty heavily. To be fair to the defenders, they don't have a hugely elite army themselves. They do have a couple of units here of nomadic light infantry, I believe, with the armour upgrades. So, you know, not exactly the last word in terms of quality, but then they will be facing off against in the vast majority, units of a very similar type to themselves. This is the General's Bodyguard for Engsfitz. We've got a unit of Nurad Warchief's Retainers. They should be, as long as they keep their halberds pointed at the enemy and don't get surrounded, they could be very powerful in this situation. More Bowmen and more Nurad Retainers. And now we're going to be getting into Eclipse 2500 of the Dark Cloud's army, which is spread out between the Stone Fortress and this outer settlement. So we've got some Southron Warbands, some AP Spears, very efficient most of the time. We've got some Haradrim Spears, more Southron Warband, which all of these units are not the highest of quality. Haradrim Spearmen especially are not exactly hugely elite. Some more Southron Warband, and that's pretty much it for the support out here. So he's just got some Spearmen out here. But inside the fortress, you would imagine he's got some stronger units. He's got some Southron archers caked in dirt, and this really is what I'm talking about. Like, I'm really not a fan of the sort of how it doesn't really mesh very well. It's actually better on this map. Well, it's better on. Seems to be a little bit better looking on this map than it was on the previous one. So I think lighting does have something to do with it as well. But even so, I'm still not the biggest fan of it, to be honest with you. It's a neat idea if, you know, the textures can be made a little bit better, but we'll see. Meanwhile, having a look at some other of Harad's units, we've got some Southron Pikemen, obviously again. They are AP, I think, but their stats are very low, so when they get breached, as pikes tend to do, they will be taken care of pretty quickly. Serpent Guard should be fairly safe in terms of going 1-to-1 with a lot of the other enemy infantry units. The Beast Hunters are also going to be a very important tool here. They're AP and melee, as well as their javelins, of course. More Pikemen, more Warband, more Serpent Guard. There isn't really a huge abundance of elite units here, which is interesting. Most of the time when I see a scenario, there's tons for both the attackers and the defenders. So this might affect things a little bit here. We've got some Southron Pikemen. We've got something up on the walls here, I think. Indeed we do. We have some more Haradrim Archers. Actually, that's the first unit of basic Haradrim Archers we've seen. And then finally, the defending general, is actually a unit of the dismounted Serpent Guard with the armor upgrade, so they've got the Black Serpent armor model. But I don't actually think Harad have got any multiple HP units on display, which is interesting. But now I will make a little cut because I think the attackers are probably going to take, particularly the 3 in the north, which are a little bit further away, are going to take their time to get into position, so I will rejoin when the battle is joined. So as the cavalry charges across the plains, things got going faster than I was expecting, and probably quite wisely. Engsvitz has decided to single out a single army as his prey, although he has chosen an army that does actually have skirmishers, interestingly enough. Now, it's entirely possible that the army in the south cannot commit themselves forward until the 3 in the north have done something, which would make some sense considering the positioning here. Not that the army in the south would probably want to move forward until they've got support, because they don't have any range and they are not exactly the finest in terms of quality as a single entity. Meanwhile, something that I have been thinking about doing is disabling reshade, by the way. I would like people's feedback on that. The lighting would probably be made a little bit worse by that, but it would also probably make things a little bit smoother. And I would hope, anyway, sort of improve things like the frames when things get a little bit hectic. But that would only be something that I would do if people wanted me to, because I have noticed people do quite like the reshade in the past. And I wouldn't remove it without first consulting people, but it has been something that I've been thinking about, and I honestly think it would probably be worth my time to do so. These Goblin Archers are trying to get some counterfire into the Nomadic Light Cavalry with some success. Meanwhile, we can see over here the Snaga have revealed themselves, and they are a Javelin unit, which the Nurad Retainers immediately barge their way into. Snaga Skirmishers are not the sort of unit that the Misty Mountains want to lose this early, because these Javelins could play an important role as the battle unfolds. And you can see actually that the Halberds are moving forward, but it's a bit of a catch-22 for Lister here, because he can't really put his Halberds and park them on the front line, because they will be the ideal targets for the Horse Archers, of course. Meanwhile, we've got another charge coming in here, this time on just some standard Goblin infantry. But these Nurad Retainers, they're pretty tough, honestly. They've got, decent shields. Not the easiest things to bring down, especially not for, like, really low-tier archers like the Goblins. Meanwhile, over here, you can see that over here the Heavy Goblin Halberd are finding themselves the target of the Nomadic Light Cavalry, which is unsurprising. But Khand obviously very much at home in this sort of warfare, sort of spreading themselves out throughout the plains and using their manoeuvrability. Interestingly enough, it would probably be a little bit better for them if they didn't have the red line right here, because then they could start really sort of pressuring this Misty Mountains army from both sides. But as it is, this won't be happening. It might be actually... I'm actually surprised that the Misty Mountains don't have any wargs to their name in this fight, because it wouldn't exactly be a super powerful thing for them to have. I mean, Khand can go toe-to-toe with wargs for the most part anyway, and with the abundance of horse archers here, but it would still be nice for the Misty Mountains to have some sort of manoeuvrability so they aren't just picked off slowly. You can see the shower of arrows that are coming forth from the Goblin Archers, however, and it is worth saying as we sort of get into position over here that the Nomadic Light Cavalry, not exactly the toughest. They do have a shield, but they are, can't have better horse archers is what I'm trying to say. But this definitely is, a battle more focused around the lower tiers, which I'm actually in favour of, because you don't actually see this sort of thing very often. Oftentimes scenarios pack the armies full of elite units, and in particular when the defenders are outnumbered, that is bad news for them, because the attacking elites often get committed when the defenders are already out of steam, and that pushes the fight to end one way. Meanwhile, the dust-covered goblins are still being harassed by the Nomadic Light Cavalry, and certainly the Halberds would be my first target. Without the Halberds, they won't be able to go polearm to polearm. With the defensive positions back down in the south, interestingly enough, we've got some action happening over here, as the Nurad Retainers did charge into the sides of this Goblin infantry, again just trying to do some harassment damage. Interestingly enough as well, you can see in the south as things sort of move on the mini-map that the Orc army in the south is also starting to move towards the Stone Fortress, and actually the defenders are abandoning the outer settlement, deciding instead to go back to the Stone Fortress, which is interesting. It's probably the clever thing to do, to be honest with you. It's a much more defensive position. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for the Orcs to get much in the way of traction, especially if they continue to lose stuff like the Snaga skirmishers as they have done with all of the cavalry harassment so far. But they need to be careful. These Nurad Retainers are shaken. And as we go down here, we can see that we've got some Variag Windriders down here, again charging into the Goblins. The Goblins not liking this treatment one bit. But they're probably pretty fortunate, honestly, that they're not being faced by a unit like the Variag Cataphracts or the Brotherhood of the Lance, because they would be doing really grievous damage to units like this. Like, honestly, with a good charge, it would be the sort of thing that can rout individual units instantly. These Neurad Retainers need to be real careful, though. They were shaken for a moment there. They're trying to get, I think, to some of the skirmishers, but I think Froggy's probably going to be okay. He's got his ducks in a row quite nicely. He's got, you know, all of his fodder around the outside, and if he's paying attention, he will have, well, he's routed off that unit of Neurad Retainers. They will probably come back. There's enough of them to come back, but delve too deeply and too greedily there, Engsfitz. Unfortunately for him. But yeah, keeping good shape like that is often the way to go, because even though you will take losses on stuff like your Goblin Infantry, it's only one unit of cavalry, and there's only so much damage they can do, especially a unit of melee cavalry like that. As the Neurad Retainers seem to be cycling out from Lister's army as well. Meanwhile, let's go and have a look down here in the south, as we can see Arcturus is moving up to the walls with his Orc fodder. Interestingly enough, actually, Arcturus could get there first, and he could cut off this army as it tries to retreat. Now, this would, of course, open up a counter-attack from the Stone Fortress as well, as it comes out to try and envelop Arcturus's army. But it would definitely be a bit of an annoyance for the defenders, because they definitely don't want their army to be split and sort of picked off, especially when, you know, the numbers are so heftily in the attacker's favour, even though they don't have the most in terms of quality. If the defenders can't get into a good defensive position, they could still end up just being overwhelmed. See, actually, those Orc fodder sort of circumventing the Southron Warband a little bit, as another unit of Southron Warband comes into position. Obviously, the Orc fodder, not the finest, but they are still getting into a position, making it difficult for the defenders to sort of regroup. And I think, as you can see from the mini-map, all of the Khan cavalry is coming back down here now to try and help out against Arcturus' very aggressive advance, which will then necessitate the other armies from the north getting down here quickly. You know, I've noticed Lister's army there doesn't seem to have moved very far from the corner. They can't afford to be that passive. They need to get in here quickly, otherwise Arcturus' army is likely to be routed and destroyed before he ever gets down here. This Orc fodder is already shaken as it tries to hold back the slew of Khandish infantry as it comes back through here. But Arcturus is into position, and he is able to halt the advance of some of these units. In particular, you know, the Variad Warriors is a good catch. It's a unit which, individually, if it was 1-to-1, the attackers would actually struggle a little bit to defeat. But as it is, if they can overwhelm them here and destroy them outside the walls, they're in a pretty good place. Got some Neurad Retainers who are going to try and charge in from the side. The Orc fodder are spears, though. Very shitty spears, but they can still do some business against cavalry. Exactly the sort of thing which Orc fodder would ideally be used for most of the time, just sort of trying to trap cavalry in their web. These Neurad Retainers charging into the Orc Maulers, already actually causing them to become shaken, as we're just going to turn things down here as we zoom in on things. The Orc Maulers should be able to deal some damage if they're able to land hits on the Neurad Retainers, but as it is, the Khandish cavalry has managed to scoot down south pretty quickly, and you would imagine that Arcturus' army is probably going to start to struggle fairly substantially if this keeps up. More Orc fodder that is wavering, but they are chasing off the nomadic scouts. Then again, the attackers probably wouldn't mind if the nomadic scouts use their axes on Orc fodder. They probably won't mind that the horse archers are expending more of their ammunition on the Orc fodder either. The less skirmishes they have to deal with later on when they're actually attacking the stone fortress, the better as far as they're concerned. Back up to 1 speed. Those horse archers need to be careful. They do actually get caught a little bit by the Orc Maulers, and a few of them do go down, but as they go past they also take a few of the Orcs with them, with a nice drive-by shot there. Orc fodder doing their best. I mean, Arcturus, this is an army full of fodder. Well, these Neurad Retainers charging into the unit of Moranon Infantry. The Moranon Infantry is shaken as well. The Moranon Infantry do not have an anti-cavalry bonus, and they're already wavering, so not an ideal situation for them. This unit of Moranon Infantry is also routing off and broken. So initially this engagement wasn't too bad for this Mordor army, but ultimately I think he spread himself out too much. He needed to keep himself in a nice blob so that he wasn't so vulnerable to this sort of thing, because now the cavalry is able to pick and choose its targets. There are a few very juicy targets as well, like the Moranon Infantry and the Orc Maulers in this situation are priority target number 1. The Orc fodder you can basically just leave for your infantry because they're not really going to win any competitions there. Yeah, these Orc Maulers defeat is almost a certainty. They have managed to do some damage to the Khandish cavalry, however, which is going to make harassment a little bit more difficult, and also Arcturus has not committed his entire army forwards. Again, that might be a stipulation in the rules that he wasn't allowed to. But even so, it's probably a good thing that he hasn't committed all of his forces forward, because so far this has not gone too well. The biggest positive he can take from this, really, is the fact that he has managed to whittle down the mobility of Khan a little bit. The sooner that the attackers can make this a battle of attrition, the sooner they can start to make some inroads, but for the time being, the defenders are still able to use their mobility and their quality in situations like this to individually pick off units. And in particular, the retainers here have done pretty well. Obviously, the retainers, tough. Probably the most dependable Khandish cavalry unit, to be honest with you, as far as, you know, very good melee cavalry, obviously. And in this sort of situation against these lower tier infantry units, they are also proving to be a bit of a menace. Yeah, this is pretty much the end of Arcturus' army there. Lister, I'm beginning to think that perhaps he is not allowed to commit himself forward as quickly, because he is lagging behind Froggy and Tundra's Fox a little bit. These Orc Maulers actually do manage to get into the Nurad retainers, inflicting a little bit more damage. And at this point, I think that's kind of the best that Arcturus can hope for. More Nurad retainers. Again, things are a little bit chaotic over here. There's actually more Orc Maulers up here who are in melee with nomadic light cavalry, which they'll probably take that engagement. They're only horse archers after all. Just trying to deal with more of this cavalry, and actually now, Arcturus' initial wave, there are still a few individual units that have survived long enough to see reinforcements come from Tundra's Fox. The Orc fodder coming in first, obviously, that's more spears, making things a little bit more dicey for Engsfitz to use as cavalry. Variag Windride is still in pretty good condition, and they're not as durable as the Nurad retainers. They are without a shield, but they're still very good against other cavalry in melee, as a lot of Khan's roster is. That's kind of their whole thing. Nomadic scouts still lurking. Another unit of nomadic cavalry. They're just trying to chase down these units so they don't come back. Interestingly enough, this Orc fodder has come back. It's already shaken, and they will probably rout pretty quickly here. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. Interestingly enough, they're managing to get a few kills here, and they do rout. That's unfortunate, because that cavalry looked like it was trying to cycle back out then, but they routed at an inopportune moment. A lot of Arcturus' army just sort of fleeing the field. And I think the Khandish cavalry finished off the Orc Maulers that were over here. But he does still have one unit, at least, Arcturus, so he just about survived as Tundra's Fox crests this hill over here. It's interesting that Harad don't have some of their archers up on this wall, because that would be ideal for the current situation, to sort of pepper them down as they approach, making things as awkward for the attackers as possible. I mean, this is a long scenario, so it's not the sort of thing which is going to be decided by how quickly the units rout off here. Routing has been a real theme of things lately. I think it does do something to dissuade the feeling that the Orcs are a little bit too strong, because a lot of the fights that I've shown recently have shown the Orcs really losing, or at least an extremely detrimental point of the battle. A lot of their forces rout off, which is let's see here. So this Orc fodder is still doing pretty well for itself. Arcturus has got 7 units, 7 Maulers still routing. Nomadic light cavalry still alive. It should probably get out of here though. I'm interested to see how the attackers handle this, because the Khandish cavalry is still a factor over here on the other side of the settlement. While the cavalry is still a major factor, they probably don't want to be committing to a full-scale assault on the fort. More fodder. But Tundra's Fox's army is pretty much here in full strength, and just in behind them you can see Froggy and his goblin horde. And this is a lot of men that the defenders have to chew their way through, and their infantry is not exactly the most elite either. The Serpent Guard will obviously beat everything 1-to-1, but in particular I think one of the key units late on could well prove to be the Nurad Warchief Retainers and the Southron Pikemen. From the front, if they manage to set up a good phalanx, I'm not sure what the attackers could do about that unless they were able to utilise their skirmish as well. We'll see if the defenders allow them to do that as we sort of move over here. I'm sure that the frames are slightly affected by reshade as well, which is why I'm considering dropping it. But again, that's something which we can speak of in the comments after the fact. But yeah, can't have managed to regroup all of their cavalry into one position. I think all of their units are still alive, even if some of them are pretty depleted at this point. They could try and go and harass Lister's army a little bit more. Try and prevent him from meeting up with his allies. But it might be worthwhile at this point to sort of think about starting an assault on the fort over here and leaving like a rear guard of fodder and spears behind you, if that is indeed the case. The only reason not to at this point would be this cavalry, and it looks as Lister sort of creeps his way forward. They could try and go in from behind and attack Froggy's army and Tundra's Fox's army from the rear. Again, it's very fortuitous for the attackers that none of these Carnish cavalry units are some of the nasty lancers. Again, the Variag Cataphracts or the Brotherhood of the Lance would be really devastating in this sort of situation, because the Variag Cataphracts in particular, because there's nothing that can really kill them quickly. You know, a knight unit in this situation could probably run over an entire army if it was used correctly. What's going on back here? So we do actually have some halberds in the back line, so not the easiest, not the softest target for all of this cavalry to try and charge into. Because if the halberds were able to start landing their blows, the Carnish cavalry wouldn't like that one bit. Let's see what's going on here. So we've got some Haradrim archers just sort of waiting up here, and they're not putting up a defence over here, which is probably wise because it allows these archers to sort of fire all the while. They are instead putting up a primary defence over here. Southron Warband and Pikemen, two Southron Pikemen sort of getting into position, and it looks as though this is going to be sort of the primary defensive point that the defenders are going to commit most of their resources to. They can't really afford to layer up too much because they don't really have the luxury of that. They don't have enough men to do so. A lot of their resources are still bound up outside the walls. You can actually see some of this Goblin infantry sort of hanging back. These nomadic scouts are coming in, so they're probably going to try and kill the heavy Goblin halberds from range with their axes, which again is probably for the best. You can see some of the axes flying into the heavy Goblin halberdiers, which is, in this sort of situation with the armies on display, actually one of the higher priority targets. Shows the quality of some of these troops that the attackers have to work with. Lots of orcs on the field, but not many of them necessarily of high quality. Goblin infantry sort of forming a defensive shield. Obviously definitely the sacrificial lambs, obviously still some horse archers with their ammunition left as well. And as I said before, the heavy Goblin halberds definitely the best target to go for. Their armour values aren't terrible, but you know, without a shield and considering the kind of unit they are, they're never really going to survive under sustained arrow fire for all that long. This Goblin infantry, meanwhile, is going to take a charge from the Nurad War Chief retainers, which is a lot of the Carnish cavalry starting to feel the strain of being constantly run around the battlefield at this point. But still, scything right through that unit of Goblin infantry without taking a single loss. This is good for Khan. What is going on over here? You see that? Okay, spooky. Meanwhile, as you see, yeah, it looks like they are going to form some sort of rear guard, because you can see Tundra's Fox is sort of setting up his fodder over here near the settlement. Those nomadic scouts there thought about, they got a little bit close there. Definitely need to use up all their ammunition before you start using them as sort of a makeshift shock cavalry, to be sure. The Goblin infantry is coming forward now. So you can see here that Froggy is doing his best to preserve his heavy Goblin halberds. He knows the value of these moving into the to the later stages of the match, when things get a little bit more grindy, as inevitably they will. As the Nurad War Chief retainers continuing to take bites out of this Goblin infantry, which can't really do much to respond, to be honest with you. Meanwhile, what's going on over here? Goblin infantry forming up the first line, and the archers still yet to open fire. Obviously they're not going to target down Goblin infantry. They're going to wait for juicier targets like the halberdiers. And you can see now on the minimap as well, the rest of Arcturus' army has also begun to move to add what remains of his army to the final assault. These Nurad retainers have done a really good job so far, though, of performing the role of a makeshift shock cavalry unit. Considering the amount of orcs and goblins on display, this battle's actually been pretty smooth so far in terms of frame rate. Yeah, the Goblin infantry routing, that's no real surprise, especially when they received a rear charge from the nomadic scouts. I don't know whether they'll come back either. This nomadic light cavalry, possibly it's out of ammunition, but again, they're going for the weak targets, the targets that they can actually do damage to. Horse archers, and some javelin cavalry might be a little bit different depending on the unit, but for the most part, cavalry that has a ranged attack is going to have a charge of 1, which means it's not going to be particularly effective. It can still do damage, of course, but for the most part, it's not their intended purpose. It's definitely the sort of thing you only do when they have expended all of their ammunition, which, you know, considering the amount of harassment Engsvitz has been doing, about now seems about the right time for horse archers to run out of ammunition. They do have a lot of ammo, of course, horse archers. More and more of these units are now starting to get behind this line of fodder that Tundra's Fox has set up. Based on that, I would imagine that as soon as Engsvitz has finished killing what he can kill out here, we would probably turn around and go for Lister's army. But yeah, the Khandish cavalry doing its thing, proving to be very resilient as well. Khan's units in general, when you get to their mid-tiers, their Nurad units in general tend to be tough. You know, they last a while, they've got some real staying power as the fight goes on. Obviously the Nurad footmen, a very well-known example of that, but this I think shows the durability of the retainers as well, because even though while a lot of the units that they've been going after have been lower tier, they've gone through a lot of them at this point. Nomadic scouts are also running around. It's probably for the best that the defenders did abandon this sort of outer settlement, because if they did try and hold it, they would have been surrounded and eventually overwhelmed. And considering the numbers discrepancy, it's, you know, the attackers have got such an advantage in terms of numbers that they should be doing that. And obviously the defenders, without much quality, I was expecting to at least see something like the Champions of Nafarat or maybe the Demons of the Desert for Harad, but really the only super powerful infantry that they have on the defence are the War Chief retainers. Which is a very nice one to have, admittedly. The defenders are going to have to surround them to beat them, really. They could probably hold against the sort of units that are arrayed against them indefinitely from the front without any sort of mass push. Khan regrouping their cavalry over here after doing some nice damage to Froggy as he gets behind the wall of fodder that Tundra's Fox has set up. This unit of heavy goblin infantry still sort of hanging out. At this point they're probably going to wait for Arcturus' army to get here. They may very well wait for Lister as well, and then sort of go in and try and win the war of attrition within the fortress. Which they don't really have any other options, to be honest. I mean, they do have some ranged power, but certainly not enough to really contest with the defenders. Defenders with their Southron archers, Haradrim archers, and then they've got their Muhad beast hunters as well. Let's go and see what's happening up here. Heavy goblin infantry. Again, you know, the heavy goblin halberds going out first, which, if Engsvitz is completely out of ammunition, might be the best choice, because they, you know, all of this cavalry is definitely not going to want to charge into the heavy goblin halberdiers. They've got an anti-cavalry bonus, obviously, when they get their halberds down. They're also armor piercing, so the resilience of the Nurad war chief, the Nurad retainers, I should say, is probably going to be substantially less against a halberd unit like this. But Lister's still lagging behind a little bit. You can see that still Engsvitz doesn't really have anything other to do than to micro his cavalry at this point. The first line of the defence within the fortress is being handled by Eclipse and his Haradrim. So he is free to micro his cavalry at will, which is nice. It's not often you get to focus just on your cavalry in this situation. Do they still have ammunition? They've got their bows out. They do still have ammunition. Horse archers do have a lot of it, of course, and again, trying to whittle down those halberdiers may very well be the best way to go, as the arrows, indeed, they are going after the halberds. Keeping an eye on the minimap though, because we do have the sort of first foray into the fortress. The goblin infantry is moving forward. Again, the defender's not really taking the bait and trying to shoot the goblin infantry down. Definitely not a worthwhile target. I imagine the halberds are going to be the primary target of all of these Harad archers as they wait menacingly. Something like the Black ORCS might be a good target as well, even though there's only one unit of them on the field today. Orc Maulers are another good target. We shall see. Bit of a lull going on here, but I'm loath to make a cut because there is still the possibility of all of this cavalry coming into play out here from Engsvitz as he continues to make Lister's life a bit of a misery by cycling around and doing some damage. Looks like he is going to charge in with the Wind Riders. The Wind Riders won't like being under arrow fire too much because of their lack of a shield, but they'll do their best. There are the Gob Archers. Good target to go after this. Robbing the attackers of any of their range power will be really useful for the late game. They need to be careful though, because the Halberdiers are in close attendance, and needless to say, they will do a nasty amount of damage to the Wind Riders if they hang around for too long. And indeed, they are shaken already. But they will be able to escape from that. More Wind Riders. A lot of the Coundish cavalry is starting to look a little bit battered now. Unsurprising considering the amount of running around and charging they've done. The Wind Riders actually are not yet tired. Khand with that home field advantage, I suppose. Taking a point-blank shot from the Wind Riders there. It's a lot of Goblin infantry. But once again, they managed to get into the archers. Using that mobility to good effect. Not killing too many of them, but still at this point, just doing a bit of chip damage is really the best they can hope for, I think. All of these horses just loitering with intent. And once again, heavy Goblin infantry having to be sort of thrown to the wolves over here as the... Well, actually, to be fair, they've managed to rout that nomadic light cavalry, so now is sort of the period of the battle where it's pretty likely that the Khandish cavalry is probably going to start routing with a little bit more frequency. A lot of their manpower has been taken away. And where actually is the Chieftain's Vanguard? Because that is going to be a unit... Yeah, the Chieftain's Vanguard still with 32 men in the unit. That's going to be a unit that's not going to rout quite so easily, and obviously multiple HP. So tough to bring down. Probably not even worth wasting your arrows on that, to be honest with you, which is counterintuitive when compared with the other horse archers. Most of the time you want to counter horse archers with foot archers, but not in this case, I don't think. I think you want to save your arrows for another time and just sort of zone the Chieftain's Vanguard out. Because if you can just make them sort of have to wait, not wanting to charge into your halberds, that's probably the best thing you can do at this point. Hello, another charge coming in here across the hill. From the Variag Wind Riders going into the heavy Goblin infantry once more. Again, every man counts in a situation like this. The defenders have had a huge numbers discrepancy at the start, so any casualties they can inflict is a welcome bit of news for them before the main event starts in the Stone Fortress. Well, I'd be interested to see if the defenders really do have enough to weather this storm, as Lister is sort of creeping forward sort of piece by piece, trying to weather the storm. Do we have an engagement here yet? Not quite, and still the archers hold their fire, because again, just fodder and Goblin infantry in here. The fodder would be well advised to not go charging into this Haradrim phalanx, because they would not make any sort of progress against Southron Warband and Pikemen when they're in unison. Southron archers back here, they've got more Southron archers, beast hunters, Variag bowmen as well, so it's worth saying that Khand have got their archers as well, but it's whether they have enough infantry to hold this line, I think. Because they've got enough in terms of ranged presence, certainly. Oh, and here we can see the Southern Warband breaking ranks, hoping to catch the Orc fodder. The Orc fodder went forward without anything in terms of support. And obviously that would be very bad. You know, you can't afford to lose a unit willy-nilly like this. So yeah, still sort of the calm before the storm in there. Meanwhile, Nurad retainers continuing to charge into Lister's army, the heavy Goblin infantry. Again, for its class of unit, for how cheap it is, the heavy Goblin infantry can be a useful thing, but in this sort of situation they're really struggling to sort of deal with the constant cavalry pressure they're under, because they don't have the highest attack values at the best of times, and they don't have an anti-cavalry bonus, so the Nurad retainers are able to tank most of the damage that they dish out. There we can see some heavy Goblin halberds sort of trying to come back, but halberds, of course, and polearms in general, not the speediest unit. And there we can see another routing unit, so another good pickup there from Engsvitz, another unit routing off. Probably not going to return with that many men in the unit either, especially with the continuing falling manpower that it has. Chieftain's Vanguard still with 32 men in the unit. Even without Lancers, this cavalry has proven to be a real menace to this army. This would of course be a different story if the attacking armies had some of the elites that you've come to expect, like for example the Misty Mountains, if they had something like more White Orc Spearmonks, especially if they had heavy Goblin crossbows. At this stage in the battle it would be difficult to use the cavalry in this manner, but obviously in a 2 versus 4 the sort of difficulties the attackers are having are very much engineered to make it so that they can't simply use their numbers to roll forth and crush the defenders. But it is still up to the defenders to use their resources wisely, and I think Engsfitz so far has done that. Meanwhile, you can see these soldiers continuing to mass up. There still isn't really a soft target other than the Orc Maulers for the archers to go after. But the arrows just sort of waiting, and I think they're probably waiting for the blob, and then, you know, I would probably turn fire arrows on at that point, because a lot of these Orc units are lower tier, and they don't have the luxury of having any units that can buff them. I mean, very often in scenarios you see something like the Troll Drummers or Sauron's Will to help bind your line together. This is a luxury which the attackers do not have in this situation, so fire arrows could well prove to be their bane, as could the low morale of a lot of these units. You know, a lot of them are exhausted, tired, some of them are shaken already. What's going on out here? Variag Windriders still proving to be a real pain. Halberds are now being used as the backstop, however, which is a much less enticing proposition to try and charge into, but a lot of Lister's army is now sort of moving forward as quickly as he can. Still stretched out though, and the units that he has left behind still represent a nice target for Engsfitz to go after, because as soon as Lister is sort of joined in the assault, the cavalry becomes a little bit less useful, because they can simply put some spearmen in a choke point behind them, the entrance to the stone fortress, and the cavalry becomes much more difficult to use, especially with all the ammunition they've already expended. I would imagine they don't have much ammunition left, if any. Again, Goblin Archers, another good pickup. Variag Windriders doing what they can. Not going to be able to kill all of them. They might make them rout. That would be a very good thing for the defenders, robbing the attackers of what little range power they have. Do we have the melee engagement? We do. So it begins. So obviously fodder, Goblin Infantry. Morannon Infantry is on the front line as well, which will do better, but this Harad Phalanx is going to be pretty good at dealing with this, honestly, because, you know, the Morannon Infantry will struggle against the AP. And just in general, the Harad units, they've got a double Phalanx, actually, which they'll probably move up to combine into one long line. Dismounted Serpent Guard as well. So the attackers are trying to use numbers here, which is risky because they need to basically keep a constant feed of reinforcements coming in here. Obviously they're avoiding the Haraja marchers quite admirably, and some of these units are managing to seep around the side, so they didn't manage to sort of keep their whole line solid, which could be a mistake they really come to rue. These Orc Maulers have managed to get around the side, and they will be able to engage, particularly if they can start cutting down these Southron pikemen, the real heart of this phalanx. And indeed, here come the fire arrows. That is an unsurprising sight to see. The morale debuff could well prove to be the key thing here. And again, Harad's units on the front line don't exactly have the most morale either, so it could be a double-edged sword here as the fight really gets underway. Nomadic Raiders back there. Again, units like the Variag Warriors in close attendance. This engagement right here could decide the battle. If the attackers are able to roll over this defence, particularly in this area over here where the line has sort of crumbled a little bit, and Tundra's Fox is able to get his Orc Maulers behind there, and now they're sort of force pathing their way through. Units like the Southron Pikemen, as I said, they're AP, but their stats are really bad. Even for pikes, their stats are not great. So as soon as they get compromised, they fall apart quickly. Speaking of falling apart though, naturally, the Orc fodder not doing well under the hailstorm of fire arrows that they are being subjected to. Serpent Guard, obviously they're going to do very well against the vast majority of these units. The Orc Maulers, actually, their AP will be most useful against the Serpent Guard of all these units, but even so, look at all those fire arrows. Huge frequency coming out there from the lower tier Haradrim archers, doing some good damage there. This part of the line is still fighting, however, and they are actually pushing on the other side as well, and victory does seem like a possibility over here. Once again, it's the Orc Maulers helping out the heavy Goblin infantry. And it could be in the end the defenders simply don't have the amount of infantry necessary to hold this sort of assault at bay forever. And the defenders are going to layer up somewhat, so these are all the resources they committed to defending this initial position, but then they've got this higher area up here as well. We'll see how well that treats them. Variag Bowman getting up over here as well to start firing down. Ran on guard, but You know, these archers are obviously the ace in the hole for the defenders. They've got such a good position that they can fire into. The fire arrow is going to do a lot of morale damage. And with all of these units, routing is going to be a serious problem for the attackers. Keeping up an assault as the attackers in this sort of situation is pretty much, you know, the thing you need to do to achieve victory, because you've got so much in terms of numbers you would expect to be able to win, but you know, if you can't get all of your men in the same place at the same time, all fighting the enemy, then it doesn't really matter too much. So far, the archers have all done a pretty good job. You can see here the Moran on infantry. They've managed to sort of close in from the sides of this choke point, but all it's really done is expose their backs to point-blank fire from this unit of Southron archers, while the Serpent Guard hold them in place from the front. So they may have made some gains, but they're still in a pretty difficult spot, and there's still a couple of units of Southron pikemen that can be committed forwards. Just have a little look back here at what's still being left behind. So you can see the heavy goblin halberds. Slowly but surely Lister's army is sort of being committed forward. There's a lot of red still on the radar, so it's going to be a long bumpy road for the defenders as this continues. But they do still have their cavalry, which, you know, in the late game could prove to be a bit of a difference maker. Over here we can see the choke point fight continues. The Variag warriors are in here. Variag warriors can often seem to be a little bit fragile, I've found, but in this sort of situation against this sort of foe, it's pretty much their ideal intended target, really. These are sort of units which they are more skillful than sort of the trash men, really. They take out the trash, but you know, when it comes to fighting more elite units, they can struggle a little bit. They should be fine against the vast majority of units here. Really, the numbers are going to be the only thing which will worry the defenders, but all of these arrows, of course, eventually as well, the defenders will run out of arrows. And oftentimes in a scenario, there's been a lot of scenarios where the defenders, it looks like they've been doing really well at the start, and that's mainly because their arrows and their range support has been doing so much work, and then when they run out of arrows, their defense tends to run out of steam a little bit. The Muhad Beast Hunters are also in position, and they're firing their javelins already, again sort of into the big blob. The Moran on infantry represents a pretty good target, actually. The AP would be most useful against them, and definitely the sort of thing which will be binding this assault together. More and more units coming in, but more and more units coming in that are sort of already wavering on contact with the enemy. As expected to a certain extent, morale proving to be a problem. Meanwhile, another problem for the attackers is that Engsfitz is still using his cavalry to pretty good effect. Still picking and choosing his targets well, stripping away some of the manpower of the attackers as they move forward, and this is pretty much the archetypal scenario, to be honest with you. The orcs just being pushed forward in droves to die, while the defenders do their best with the resources they have. But this is the sort of battle the defenders could very much win. The balance of power was very much against them in the opening portion of this battle. But as time has gone on, they do have a lead of 13%. That's not a huge lead, to be honest with you. But you know, we'll see. We'll see how this develops as the cavalry continues to charge in. Goblin infantry. They really need to get all of their units behind this fodder line. Let the fodder take the charge, and then you know they've got their anti-cavalry bonus, and then try and trap the cavalry in with your mass. If you charge away from the fodder, all you're doing is inviting Engsfitz to sort of charge back in and rob you of more of your units. And he still has cavalry in reserve through the sandstorm. Meanwhile, all of these units pointing the wrong way. Some of these units might come back. 171 is a substantial unit. They will probably come back. And again, 205, 239. That's a unit I would certainly expect to return as we sort of look from on high over here. There's the classic scenario, dying frame rate, but they are pushing their way through. It's been very costly for the attackers, but they are now managing to get through this area. The orc maulers are in. They need to be careful not to go too far, however, because they're in a dangerous area here. There's a lot of infantry units that the defenders could send forward to rout them off pretty quickly, and they would not then come back because they would probably be just sort of trapped and killed. The orc maulers charging in. Nomadic Raiders blocking their way. Nomadic Raiders are actually not the sort of unit you want sort of holding the line. They're a low tier archer unit, so all hands on deck here The fire arrows continuing to do a lot of damage to the orcs, but will it be enough here? Will it be enough? The Hurrah Generals come forward as well, the Serpent Guard with the armour upgrade. They do still have reserves, the defenders, in case things go pear-shaped, but these Orc Maulers' victory is almost a certainty. What are they fighting? Serpent Guard? Well, they're also taking javelins in the back, so that victory seems certain won't last for very long at all. Oof. As the fire arrows continue to just cascade into the orcs. They have managed to push the defensive line back though. It was here initially and now it's here. And there is a gap they can use to sort of funnel in over here, but I think the defenders have probably got themselves sorted out. The Serpent Guard can come in over here and block that route if they so chose. Oof, this is not good though. The orcs, even without dedicated pushing units, are still using their mass because of their numbers. Now this is the sort of thing which could backfire pretty spectacularly, of course. If they go into the late game with...
We have bled the enemy badly. They have only half their men left.
Well, like I said, if they go into the late game with a lack of... If they can't do this in the late game, they'll be in trouble when they come to fight something like the Nurad Warchief Retainers. Here come the Serpent Guard again, sort of blocking that approach, which is good to see. Ruhard Beast Hunters coming in. They are AP in melee, so they will be able to help out against stuff like Heavy Goblin Infantry. More Moranon Infantry coming in, though, from Arcturus, and the Heavy Maulers, so his general is now going to be on the front line. And that should provide a little bit more encouragement to the troops. The rally ability is honestly, you know, not as useful as you would expect it to be, but it's something at least. In the absence of an inspiring unit, it will have to do. The orcs are trying. They really need to make some sort of breakthrough here, because they've committed a lot of resources to pushing the defenders back. And they've taken a lot of damage doing so, so they need something to show for it. They have done damage to the defending infantry, but it's whether or not they have the power to sustain this. More Beast Hunters. There's another unit of Dismounted Serpent Guard, which is the General's unit. Oof. Grizzly. Meanwhile, let's have a look at what's going on the outside of things. Lister's army still sort of just slowly but surely making its way in, so we'll start to see some of his units now fighting on the front. A big long column of red there on the minimap as they sort of, some units funneling in, some units funneling out. Certainly an archetypal war of attrition. There's still a few units outside of the fodder backstop over here, but I think they're all halberds, which is not the ideal target to try and charge, so yes indeed. So there's a limited amount at this point, I think, that Engsvitz can do with his cavalry, but he will be keeping all of this fodder tied up, having to defend the rear. And honestly, it's going to be all hands on deck for the attackers if they can't make some sort of breakthrough soon. And you can see, well, victory does seem certain at this point for the attackers. So it could be that all of this punishment they've taken eventually may prove to be worth it. Haradrim archers still firing. I'm sure they've got tons of kills at this point. Those fire arrows also proving to be good in terms of routing units. It's worth saying as well that this does not include routing units, this figure. So while it's now very even in terms of the percentage of kills, the defenders will still be winning in terms of overall percentage because of all of the units that have routed, because they do not count towards that total. But the fact that it is dead even is bad for the defenders. They need to start doing some real damage to the attackers again. And actually the Warchief Retainers are on their way down, so it may be that they actually just sort of abandon the layered defense and try to just defend this area over here, which is probably a good idea, honestly. I don't know if they've really got enough up there to make it worth defending. What have they got? Yeah, Haradrim Spearmen and Nomadic Light Infantry. Those are lower tier units, which, you know, fair enough. In the late game they could be the difference between victory and defeat, but I'm not sure. The Nurad Warchief Retainers, on the other hand, as long as they don't get surrounded, as long as they keep their enemies in front of them, it's going to be real difficult for the attackers to do much with that. They are breaking through though over here. Let's hope it doesn't crash there. Meanwhile, Moranon Guard and Moranon Infantry both now getting to the Haradrim Archers in melee, and this is where the lack of quality of the defenders could start to come into things, because now the numbers of the attackers, they could spread out all over the place, and in places they're going to have to try and hold the lines with stuff like Southron archers and Haradrim archers, which stuff like Moranon infantry will be able to beat quite comfortably, especially with the backup of all of this trash. Nurad Warchief retainers are here though, going to be giving the dismounted Serpent Guard a hand. They need to get into melee though, because things are not looking great even for the Serpent Guard at this point in time. Might be time for some daring cavalry plays on the outside, trying to charge into that fodder and break them, so that morale shocks can come from behind with that cavalry that they've got outside the settlement. More Southron archers being committed to the front, again just more warm bodies for the front line. Yeah, this Moranon infantry is now going to really start to pay dividends when they're fighting off against skirmishers that are either out of ammunition or they've just been caught in melee. It's the sort of thing that Moranon infantry can do really, really well. You know, Orc units are not really thought of for their quality, but you know, they're only fighting Haradrim archers in melee. Nurad Warchief retainers trying to get into position. We've got some Variag bowmen. These Variag bowmen and nomadic raiders still have ammunition, so there's still arrows being sort of flooded into the attackers, but you know, if we have a look over this ridge, you can see that Lister's army is arriving, and this could be the hammer blow from which the defenders might not be able to recover. And these Goblin archers have been in position now for a little while, and the damage that they've been doing could have been substantial, and they could target the Nurad Warchief retainers. That would definitely be the target I would go after, because if you kill the Nurad Warchief retainers in this sort of situation, I think honestly you win. They are the one unit of really genuine infantry quality that the defenders have, and if you can rob them of that, then units like your Minas Morgul bodyguard and Goblin King's bodyguard turn into the strongest units on the field, so you can add that to your numbers advantage as well. Fire arrows coming in, and they are going after the Nurad Warchief retainers. Interestingly enough, they might have been better off not using the fire arrows there, because that will immediately alert Engsfitz to the fact that they are targeting his primary infantry unit, when they may wish to have kept that a secret. But now we can see that the envelopment may very well start to begin. The line has been broken and breached, and Moranon infantry and Moranon guard are now going to be attacking these units from behind. A lot of units are starting to fight to the death. There's still a long way to go in this fight, which sort of leads me to believe that this isn't going to be quite so easy for the attackers. Usually it's this sort of situation where the attackers start to do some real damage. So what's going on with the cavalry out here? And indeed, Engsfitz doing his best to kill off some of these units of fodder, which he is doing an admirable job of, because he needs to start attacking this long column of infantry from behind, because the attackers have basically committed everything at this point. Everything is either in the entrance to the stone fortress or sort of further in. So the scope of the attack is now sort of known. Oh, and these nomadic scouts still have some axes to throw. Perhaps going after the heavy goblin halberdiers. At this point just trying to kill anything they can, trying to even the numbers a little bit more. The Chieftain's Vanguard could yet prove to be a thorn in the side of the attackers, because if they don't have sufficient halberds to deal with them at the end, it's hard to see how they can even kill them. Still, we shall see. Nurad Warchief retainers are in full retreat at this point. These nomadic raiders blocking the advance of the attackers, as are the Variag bowmen. Moranon infantry are pursuing. They're sort of really trying to pin the Nurad Warchief retainers in place, and they took a beating actually. Only 58 of them remaining, and you know, 20 or so men may not seem like a lot, but when they're as strong as the Warchief retainers are, you really don't want to be losing them cheaply. But at this point in time, it's a little bit difficult to sort of tell them apart. But you can actually see that Arcturus' general, the heavy maulers, they're battered, but they're still fighting there on the front line. And the general has not yet died. No generals have died yet, unless I'm going mad and I've just simply forgotten. Again, it's really hard to tell where the corpses begin and where the battle begins within this sort of mess, but you can see that the attackers have done a good job. And this is without sort of pushing units, so they definitely had to take their fate into their hands there, because if that did not work, then the attackers would have been in a terrible situation, because they would have lost a huge amount of manpower for basically no gain. And then they would have been routing, and it's possible then that routing units could have been picked off by the cavalry waiting outside the fortress. The Moran Guard is breaking. Moran Infantry is breaking. Goblin King Bodyguard is forwards now, however, so now we're starting to see some the few units of genuine quality on the field today. And it's maybe a good thing they did keep some units in reserve, even if it is only Nomadic Light Infantry and Heraldrium Spearmen, because they only have this choke point to defend now. But beyond that, it's honestly difficult to... I think that would probably be the final stand of the infantry at the very least, so whatever they can save to get back there would be appreciated, but I think it's going to come down to how big a part the cavalry plays in this, and there's a shower of arrows going into the back there of the Serpent Guard, only killing a couple, but the defenders can't afford much more of that. And unfortunately for the defenders as well, some of the heavy goblin halberds are now being used as the backstop, which means they're going to have to try and charge into that. The Chieftain's Vanguard still have their missiles, but how much damage they're going to be able to do is debatable. They're trying to sort of smash their way through, but the Nomadic Scouts are not going to have the charge bonus necessary. They don't have the manpower necessary at this point either, and they'll probably break here, honestly, in the face of halberds, and indeed they do. As the arrows come flying in, doing more damage. More heavy goblin halberds waiting around the corner as well, so it's not like they're in short supply of that sort of thing. This heavy goblin infantry is coming outside though. I mean, this could be a good pickup here for the defenders. If they can charge this heavy goblin infantry, it's beyond the scope of the halberds. Would be another good kill, potentially. And Engsfitz does spot it, so he's going to come in with his retainers, and this could be another unit of heavy goblin infantry dealt with, but they're not exactly in short supply on this field. It seemed like, you know, we were all, you know, like 20 or so units on the field today of heavy goblin infantry. I'd be interested to see the size of the attackers' armies based on the units they have. Nomadic Scouts also getting a charge. Another army falling below the halfway point. That's probably Froggies. They're wavering. They're going to escape, and now they need to get out of there before the heavy goblin halberd do too much more damage. Those Chieftain's Vanguard though, if they hadn't used their ammo up to this point, if they still have full ammunition, they could weaken the halberdiers to the point where it becomes viable to try and charge through, but Engsfitz needs to preserve what little remains of his cavalry better than this. I mean, charging them into this wall of halberds, maybe not the solution here. It doesn't work like it did in The Two Towers and Return of the King. The Rohirrim just rode through polearms in both those movies. Doesn't work in the game. But it's not stopping Engsfitz from giving it a bloody good go. As the Nomadic Scouts go charging in for another bite of the cherry, but they don't really achieve much. Chieftain's Vanguard still firing away. I'll rejoin that in just a moment. Let's have a look at what's left for the defenders in terms of their defensive line. So they did actually save a unit of Nomadic Raiders. You know, maybe not the most glamorous unit, but at this point they need to save what they can. If they did still have archers, they could place them up here and get some nice rear shots in there, but I'm not sure whether any of these bowmen do still have their ammunition. I mean, these guys have still got their bows out. I would definitely put them here just so you can hit the enemy army in the back rather than over here, because hitting them in this, well, I guess it's much of a muchness. And over here, at the very least, if it's all hands on deck, you can quickly commit them to melee as well. What's going on here? This dismounted Serpent Guard needs to be real careful, unless it has a Death Wish. Again, even though there's only 20 of them, Serpent Guard, not the sort of thing you can afford to just throw away. They are just charging in, though. You can actually see as well, I think I've pointed this out before, but this sort of large curved hook sword is something from Dark Souls 1. It's the Server curved greatsword that you find at the base of Blighttown. It's not a great weapon, to be honest with you, but still, fun facts. Serpent Guard are going to retreat, which is probably wise. They need to use their strength in numbers here. Now we shall probably see the what the Nurad Warchief retainers are really worth, because they're going to be the centre point of this defence. Nomadic Light Infantry and Heraldrium Spearmen alone will not cut the mustard here. Meanwhile, let's have a little bit look over here, nomadic scouts, the Chieftain's Vanguard, presumably they're out of ammunition at this point. A little bit of a shuffling in that line there. Bit of an ill-timed manoeuvring there, but I mean at this point there's not really much else Engsfitz can do. If he continues to just sort of wait with his cavalry, eventually it's going to become sort of a non-factor in the battle, so he needs to try and do something. But it looks as though this section of the line is the most promising, just trying to charge through the fodder. And, you know, so far Engsfitz has been trying to charge in the middle of the line, which has been the halberds, which, considering they're in their phalanx, you don't really want to do that if you can help it. And I think he's really only got one unit of cavalry left, and it is the Chieftain's Vanguard, and they have now started to lose unit models as well. And unfortunately, I mean, you know, this unit of heavy goblin halberds as well, probably going to be enough to shore up this line indefinitely. I don't think the Chieftain's Vanguard will be able to smash their way through. This is where a unit of lancers would have been so helpful, because the Variag cataphracts would have been able to charge and would have been able to do substantial damage even to a unit like halberds, and the morale damage they would have done from that would also have been substantial. As it is, though, with the resources they have, I'm not sure Khan will be able to pull this out. We are within the final 10,000 frames, though. I mean, finally he's gone for the weaker portion of the line, because honestly, if I were him, I would try and just sort of circumvent the situation, which he's trying to do now. This could prove to be the end of his Chieftain's Vanguard, but at this point, you know, he needs to do something with them, otherwise they're just going to be impotently smashing their heads against this brick wall, essentially, for the rest of the fight. Some of them are getting caught, some of them are getting through. How many of them will survive by the end of this? This is good to see, though, because they are now a factor in the battle once more. 24? Losing only 6 or 7? That one probably won't make it through. He might. Let's see. You're caught, aren't you, mate? It's not going to end well for you. Well, he's just sort of sprinting in place. But now, Engsfitz can start to use this to sort of go after more vulnerable units once again, as he has been doing with his cavalry all throughout the fight. There is another backstop over here of fodder, but fodder not quite as good as the halberds. Again, the attacking archers, they did not have a lot of archers in this fight, but they've used them to good effect so far. And now they may very well have the ranged advantage, it's hard to say, but this orc fodder is not going to beat the nomadic light infantry in a fight. So the defenders just sort of leaving the line be as it stands. As soon as things get a little bit more hectic, I'd expect basically everything to be committed. What's left of the Serpent Guard, the Harad Spearmen, and of course the War Chief Retainers. There's a lot of Harad Spearmen, but of course Harad Spearmen are not really all that much better than Orc fodder when it comes down to it. They are fresh, however. Completely fresh units. Possibility of being an important part of this fight. But this may very well be the most important part of the fight as it goes. This unit of Chieftain's Vanguard, because they need to do some significant damage to the infantry before it is committed. Chieftain's Vanguard, they do get a charge off. Not a huge amount of damage though. And again, this is the problem with Horse Archers. The Chieftain's Vanguard are very good Horse Archers. They're arguably the best in the game. I would still probably give that to the Galathran Riders from Lothlorien, to be honest, but even when they're this good, they don't have the best charge. They do manage to do a lot of damage there. They use their mass, they rout a unit of Moran on guard. You know, at this point, for Engsfitz, it's just a case of doing what he can, doing his bit out here, while hoping their front line holds, which, I mean, the War Chief Retainers are strong. They're backed up by a decent amount of supporting infantry. It's going to be close. They are fairly far behind, but again, the routing units kind of skews this a little bit, so I'm not really sure what the actual percentages are, but I can believe that even with the routing, the attackers at this point are probably ahead, if only just. Chieftain's Vanguard once again charging in.
Warlord is running like a startled goat. Hunt him down.
A startled goat? And that is, yeah, it's the Heavy Maulers, so that will be Arcturus' general. Unsurprising, you know, his army's been fighting hard for quite a long time at this point. Some Goblin infantry over here. They need to just try and pull through at this point. So they're going to try and do some hefty morale shocks here, which could be good. I mean, they're going after the Goblin Archers as well. If they can rout the initial wave without having much damage done to them, that'll be a real win for the defenders. One way or another, the battle's going to be decided fairly soon, so I would imagine the attackers are probably going to force the issue and just commit everything forwards and see if the defenders can hold in such a situation. The Chieftain's Vanguard are probably going to try and finish off the Goblin firing squad. The first line in, obviously Goblin Archers are out of ammunition, Orc fodder. Nomadic Light Infantry are by no means the strongest infantry unit in the game, but against this sort of opposition they will be fairly comfortable. Still the Chieftain's Vanguard doing its best to just do what damage it can, but at this point it's going to be a little bit difficult to get a unified charge going. And that could be a rout. But they may very well get trapped here. Goblin Infantry is on rushing, just so many goblins to try and fight your way through. And the Chieftain's Vanguard at this point, only 11 of them remaining, so their hit points have long since been expended. There's some routing though, good amount of routing. The ill discipline of the Orcs.
We will leave nothing behind but widows and orphans. So
that could be Arcturus' entire army that has been dealt with at this point. I would expect it to be him, considering the his units routing from the front line there. The Serpent Bodyguard, I should say Serpent Guard, breaking ranks maybe a little bit impetuously, possibly hoping to assist the Chieftain's Vanguard in routing this initial wave, which again, you know, at this point the defenders obviously need to do something. If they just try and sit and take it, they probably won't have the best time of it. And at this point I think the Chieftain's Vanguard is probably going to be content to just try and kill this unit of Goblin Archers and then consider their job done. They've done everything they can to help. Unfortunately, however, the Nomadic Light Infantry is not going to be coming forward to support this Serpent Guard, which unfortunately for them means they're going to be surrounded and ripped apart by goblins. Most unfortunate for them. And now the Horde is coming forward, so I think the attackers are probably going to win. I think short of a big rout, I can't see the defenders managing to pull this one out. They do still have the retainers, but as strong as they are, I don't think they can kill off this many, particularly seeing as there are still heavy goblin halberds in decent number. So that means they will have something to go polearm to polearm with them. There's just so many goblins just pouring through. Most of this is Misty Mountain's forces now as well. Bits of Tundra's Fox's army are still attacked as well, but it seems like he took a bit of a beating going through that initial defence. Units like the Goblin King Bodyguard and the Minas Morgul Bodyguard are also factors that still need to be considered. Obviously, multiple HP, sword and board units, General's Bodyguards, they'll be, you know, with them. Can the defenders really pull this out? I don't think so. Chieftain's Vanguard taking point blank shots. Still charging in, still doing what they can. But that was very much a Last Samurai-like situation. They were definitely riding to their death there, and at this point there's going to be no escape as the Noose Titans. You would imagine that this is probably going to be it, even with the very low damage of all of these Goblin units that surround them. They are now sort of locked in place, and there's only one left as he makes his valiant last stand. Good cavalry play from Enkswitz, all things considered, because, you know, he didn't really have any shot cavalry and he still did a lot of damage to all the infantry that was on rushing. Could things have been different if he had been, even the Brotherhood of the Lance, which are notoriously fragile, even if he had a unit of them, things could have been a little bit different. But here we go, this is the final phase of this fight, you would imagine, as another wave comes forward crashing into the defensive line. Hard to see how the defenders fight their way out of this one. This guy is still just sort of fighting hard, surrounded by goblin filth. I don't think he's going to get out of here. He's taking a lot of slashes. He is stuck. Well, lest we miss something important, I mean, so far the nomadic light infantry is doing an admirable job holding, but I think they're probably going to need some help. The Variag bowmen still do have ammunition and are still firing into the flank of the advancing orc hordes and goblin hordes. But I think at this point they should probably at least commit one unit of Haradrim spearmen to make sure the orcs can just force their way through. This section of line in particular looking a little bit fragile. The nomadic light infantry defeat seems certain. The heavy goblin infantry much more up to the task of facing them. And I think now with the Haradrim spearmen going back into tight formation, we're going to see some reinforcement. The Narad Warchief retainers probably need to get in there as well, to be honest with you. I mean, at this point, the Chieftain's Vanguard did indeed die. It's going to take a rout to win this for the defenders at this point, I think. Variag bowmen probably out of ammunition at this point. Not terrible in melee, so their appearance on the front line will be welcome, but just a quick cursory glance over what the attackers have left. I mean, it's not that much. It says a 10% difference, but again, doesn't account for routing units. I mean, the Warchief retainers in this sort of situation could be the sort of thing which wins them the battle. But I would also say by that token that actually it looks as though the Goblin Archers just pulled out their little shanks. Ultimately, you know, it's a lot to put on the Narad Warchief retainers, though. I mean, the rest of the infantry over here is really no better in quality than the units they're facing, and they're very much outnumbered. So this is going to be the end, I would imagine, but it's very closely fought. This is a very close battle, I think, and by the end of it we will see that the attackers don't really have much of their manpower left. The Warchief retainers are going to go in, try and hold up the line. Classic scenario like Blob, the evil banners of the Misty Mountains being raised aloft. And one problem that the defenders have also, of course, is that when the line breaks in a certain position, they're going to have nothing left really to commit. They've got this one unit of Harad Spearmen in reserve, but nothing else. Good scenario though, actually. I like the back and forth. I like the fact that this one was not... I like the fact that the attackers were not able to simply rely on their elite units, because while I disagree that the attackers are overpowered, in a scenario-like situation I've seen this a lot, where it's at this stage in the fight where the attackers can just whip out the Temple Executioners, and that is basically a free win. The defenders then not only have to deal with still being outnumbered, but they then have obviously some very strong units to deal with. And they often have a pretty good number of them, like Minas Morgul Chosen are often a part of that. You know, Black Legion, Trolls as well. We didn't see any Trolls today. They can do humongous damage in certain situations. And there's the frame rate. Classic scenario frame rate when it comes to a blob like this, as we watch from on high. But yeah, I like the fact that, you know, this had that sort of...
Only half of our force remains.
That sort of dynamic to it. You know, you could argue maybe that if the Harad player had something like the Champions of Neferat, for example, as his General's Bodyguard, rather than a unit of standard Serpent Guard with the armour upgrade, this is the sort of thing which could have gone very differently. The Champions of Neferat would be able to destroy anything one-to-one that the attackers could bring to bear in a similar manner that the Narad Warchief retainers could. You know, it's a question. And again, I would say that it's highly possible that the interior of this sort of stone fortress will be decorated with like tents and maybe some buildings and such. But I can't imagine the mechanics of this fight would change all that much, whoever the maker may be. Again, there's numerous scenario makers that were in this battle, and I can't quite remember from the message whether or not I was told who it was, but even if I was, I have forgotten. What's going on here? Yeah, defeat seems certain. At this point, the attackers are going to win, which means I'm sure dislikes are coming my way. But yeah, admitting defeats. Khand and Harad still... well, just Khand at this point. I think Harad's spearmen were ill-suited to deal with this horde. So yes, the attackers will win as we're into the final 1,000 frames, but a good scenario this. I like this. I like the fact that sort of new people are making scenarios now. gives them more variety, and obviously these big set piece battles tend to be enjoyed. So it's good for me also. Obviously the frame rate is, in this sort of situation, it's not ideal. But, you know, the game has its limits. If I were to zoom in any closer than this, it would certainly crash, so I can only apologise, but this is probably going to be the view for the remainder of the fight. Classic orc tactics. Crash the game with numbers all in one spot and you can't lose. What's going on there? Oh, they're just pulling back. I guess they feel as though their job is done. They can enjoy the spoils of their victory. There goes Khan's general. Well, I mean, there's not many of them left alive to despair, to be honest. Pouring forward. Well played to all the players involved. I think there wasn't really any player that played badly in this sort of situation. I wasn't really able to criticise all that much. You know, even Engsfitz charging his cavalry into halberds was something that had to be done, really. I mean, he had no choice other than to try and force his way through that area. Otherwise, the battle would have been over sooner. So he did his best, but you know, without a unit of like knights or something, that was always going to be an uphill struggle.
Victory floats on the wind, and today the wind chose to let victory fall at our foes' feet.
I mean, you know, numbers were always going to be hard to cut through. Look at the amount of men deployed in this battle. I'm actually surprised the frame rate was as good as it was, considering the amount of men overall. I mean, just, you know, discounting things, so you've got essentially like 5,000 there. Rounding up, you know, you've got 5,000, you've got 10,000, you've got 15,000, you've got 20,000, 15, no, not 15, 23, and then 25, and then you could probably, you know, based on the numbers, you could probably maybe subtract 1,000 from that. So 24,000, all things told. That's a lot of orcs that were on display in this fight, and obviously, naturally, the defenders getting a lot of kills between them. Obviously, Khan getting a few more because they had a little bit more in terms of elites, I feel. Harad, you know, a lot of their kills doubtlessly came from their archers. Let's have a look at the kills. The Nurad War Chief Retainers did okay, but ultimately the engagements that they were in, they did well while they were in them, but they were always going to be horrendously outnumbered. Chieftain's Vanguard getting just over 600, so they proved to be very strong throughout the battle. Obviously, all of Khan's cavalry doing pretty well. Nomadic Scouts with their axe throwers, obviously the horse archers using their ammunition wisely. They didn't have too much opposition. You know, normally, if you were able to pick your armies and you were facing off against Khan, you would expect to see foot archers to act as a cost-effective counter to a lot of these horse archers, and then Nurad Retainers obviously doing very well. The Wind Riders also 418 kills, the single most other than the Chieftain's Vanguard. 484, and yeah, there's obviously nothing getting below 100 for Khan, and considering the amount of orcs they were faced with, that's not too surprising. And I'm sure it was a similar story for Harad, with probably a few units of their pikes that got forced out of the way early on, maybe falling below 100, but nothing else, I would imagine. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this this scenario, and big thank you to whoever made it. Thank you to Engsfitz for sending it in at the very least. And yeah, I don't know what I'm going to be doing next. There's a few things that I can choose from that I've been given, but we'll see. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.